Welcome to the School of Batman, a podcast where we ask academics to help Batman fight crime using their research. I'm your host, Chris George, amateur scientist and professional Batman enthusiast. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the Asylum's new wing. We're pleased to be joined by Foell, who has a PhD in neuropsychology from Heidelberg University and is currently a researcher in the Department of Psychology at Florida State University. Jens, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
We'd like to start the podcast with a little bit of background on yourself, what you're working on at the moment, what you've worked on before, what interested you as you were growing up, what you studied, what you admired. So tell us a little bit about your journey to where you are today.
Well, I've always been interested in psychology, in perception, and things like that. It's kind of weird. I mostly found my interest in when looking at movies, looking at art, and thinking about how those things work and how those things affect our emotions and our perceptions and so forth, which sort of kind of led me towards studying psychology back in Germany. And after finishing up my undergrad degree, I've realized that what really fascinates me most is looking at the brain and how the brain works and how that interacts with whatever we perceive and whatever we feel. So I was lucky enough to find a grad student position looking at how phantom limbs work in the brain and how phantom limb pain works and how that might help us develop new tools to alleviate pain. And since then, I've sort of jumped around in terms of topics. I'm still using the same methods, looking at the brain, but also looking at personality traits, at things like fear, emotion, psychopathy as well, and how that works in the brain.
Cool. So I've got a couple of questions for you straight off the bat. Could you start with telling us the difference between neuropsychology and psychology?
Psychology pertains to everything that we feel, perceive, emotions, cognitions, perceptions, all of that. And neuropsychology is part of that and basically wants to find out how all of these things relate to processes in the brain that we can measure. Okay, so that's the physical reality of the kind of manifestation of the feelings of the umbrella above it, the psychology. It's part of it. You can look at different types, different kinds. You can also go straight up into neuroscience, which in a lot of cases doesn't pertain to humans and looks at molecular processes, for example, in the brain of animal models and so forth. It can, of course, also include humans, but neuropsychology is usually done with humans and looks at perceptions, at behaviors, at emotions, and then at the processes, whatever it might be. You can use EEG to look at electrical signals in the brain. You can use functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is what I do, to look at oxygen depletion in the brain. You can find different ways of investigating processes, cellular processes and physiological processes in the brain or in the body, and try to relate those to actual behaviors and emotions.
Right, and you also talked about phantom limbs. Could you tell us a bit about what phantom limbs are and what they mean?
Sure. What we know about how the brain perceives your body is that different parts of the brain are waiting for signals from different parts of your body and responding to any sort of stimulus to different parts of your body. Now, if you lose a limb in an accident or in a clinical amputation, that throws your brain off a little bit, and these areas that are waiting for signals from your, for example, your leg that you might have lost in an accident, those cells don't have anything to do anymore, and the brain tries to adapt to that new situation. That process is not perfect, and it can often lead to a situation where you still feel like your leg, for example, is still there. And this is what we call a phantom limb. There's a wide range in perceptions about that. So for some people, it's a very clear image of their arm or their leg still being there, and they might be able to still, feel like they're using it. They might feel movement, or it might be very diffuse, just kind of a vague feeling that something is off. So there's a whole spectrum of perceptions that can come out of it. And in a lot of cases, those perceptions can be painful. And that's when we talk about phantom limb pain. This pain can go away after a while when the body or the brain adapts to a new situation, but it can also persist. And my research was on chronic phantom limb pain, on people who've had that type of pain for sometimes several decades. And we're trying to look for ways to alleviate that And we're also trying to see if popular ways to try and treat this, would lead to a reorganization of the brain. So we were basically looking at the possibility of the brain reorganizing itself back to a state that's more similar to the way it was before the amputation happened.
So that last bit there is tremendously interesting. So you say reorganizing the brain back to the state before the amputation happened. Wouldn't that mean that the brain would be thinking it would still have that limb?
So yes, I mean it's unclear why exactly this works and how it works. So the history is that a specific researcher in the United States found out that you can treat phantom limb pain by placing a mirror in front of the patient and creating a mirror image of, in that case, the hand that was lost, and asking people to imagine that the mirrored hand is a representation of their phantom hand, and sort of try to move the phantom along with whatever happens in the mirror. To basically, as you said, to trick the brain into believing that the limb is back again. So that sounds pretty esoteric, and the idea was that this researcher got the impression that a lot of phantom limbs feel cramped to the people, and he thought that maybe these cramps are the origin of phantom limb pain, which does not seem to be the case. So this was 20 years ago. So we found out in the meantime that it's probably not the reason why it works. But still, that mirror treatment seems to work for some people. Not everybody, just under half of people report pain relief when doing it. But it seems to work for some people and better than placebo. So what I did was I took patients and I asked them to do this training for 4 weeks. And I scanned their brain before and after. The theory was that for those people who benefit from treatment, the brain would in fact reorganize itself back. So basically this reorganization that happens after amputation would be reduced to some degree. That's exactly what the results showed. So only for those people who reported benefit as a result of the treatment, who reported pain alleviation, for those people the organization of the brain looked different afterwards, and it looked more closely to the way it looked in the healthy non-amputated brain.
Hey, and you say the brain reorganizing there. Is that any connection to age, or is that something that can happen up until adults? I think a lot of people's perception is the idea that once you're an adult, your brain is essentially fixed.
Yeah, we know now that the brain is adapting all the time and changing all the time, both at young age and at older age. Basically, whenever you learn something new, whenever you remember something, this is a change that happens in your brain, which is also why a lot of neuroscientists, neuropsychologists sort of ridicule the idea of, when there's a news item that says, doing this will change your brain, or what you eat might change your brain, because anything might change your brain, right? It's not good or bad in and of itself.
And when you say change your brain, do you mean literally, physically, there is a change in the material world of your brain?
Yes. So one thing is that your brain is made up of cells, right? About 100 billion different nerve cells. Each of these cells is connected to, on average, about 1,000 other cells. And these connections are where the action happens. So this is where the mental processes and your emotions and all of that is being made. Now, a cell can do several things to change. It can just change its behavior, which means that cell might be, firing more, firing less, which will change patterns in your brain. But also the more interesting thing that you just asked about is, can it actually lead to physical constant changes? And that's also true, because those connections between cells can be built, they can be undone, they can be strengthened, or they can be weakened. So the connections can be made thicker or thinner, for example, or they can be made more active or less active, or the chemicals swirling around those cells could be changed in terms of how they're created and how they're used. So there's a lot of potential to actually physically change your brain. So for example, these chemicals that I mentioned that are swirling around, they need to be taken up by the cells, and the cell can, for example, also change the number of receptors that it has to take up those chemicals. Even if the cell itself does not create new connections to other cells, it might still change itself in a way that it deals differently with neurochemicals. All of those are ways where your brain changes all the time in a physical, measurable manner.
Right, so that's a good tip for everyone listening. If there's a product which advertises to change your brain, it probably will, but it's nothing special. So thanks very much for that, Jens. I think it's now a good time for us to move on to your story. So before we start our stories, we ask our guests to choose a Batman actor that they would like to represent their Batman, and if there's any special reason why. So who have you chosen for your story, Jens?
It's a tough one for me because I grew up on the Michael Keaton Batman movies, but I do prefer Christian Bale. Those movies are just more along the lines of how I understand the Batman comics.
A new wing is being built at Arkham Asylum to house the very worst criminals that Gotham has birthed. Beyond rehabilitation, these psychopaths are consigned to live out their days under heavy security, set up by Wayne Tech after the last breakout. Looking at the data from before the incident, Bruce notices a curious uptick in admissions to this hall of last resort, and resolves to get to the bottom of this mystery. So Batman sat there in his Batcave, looking through the data, noticing that many more people are being admitted to this psychopath's last resort wing in Arkham Asylum. And the uptick seems to start from a particular date. So what could some of the potential reasons, and how could your research help identify what some of those reasons might be? Well, how would this kind of occur in real life?
There's definitely one reason could definitely be that there's myths and misconceptions about what psychopathy means. A lot of people think psychopathy means whatever a serial killer has, for example, who is just out murdering people without conscience. And it's true that a lot of serial killers would score high in psychopathy, but it's by far not the same thing. So, for example, you have historical serial killers who are very low on psychopathy, and you have a lot of people high in psychopathy who never kill anyone. So there seems to be more to it than the popular conception of it. In fact, what we know now is there's been several different ways to conceptualize psychopathy, but the one most aligned with research seems to be that psychopathy is made up of three distinct or more or less distinct personality traits that could be described as callousness, impulsivity, and fearlessness. And if you're high on all three of those, you would be high in psychopathy.
Right, I'm going to get you to take a little bit of a step back to just try and understand some of those terms that we're talking about a little bit more. So this idea of psychopathy and criminality being almost intrinsically linked in public perception, are we saying that is kind of a falsehood? Is that not every psychopath is a criminal and not every criminal is a psychopath? They're just two kind of glamorous terms that have been merged together?
It's true that they're not the same, but it's also true that they're connected in that people high in psychopathy are more likely to commit all kinds of criminal behaviors. That's certainly true, and also vice versa. If you go into a prison, you will find a higher representation of psychopathy than in the general population. But you're right in saying it's not the same. Not every psychopath, not everybody high in psychopathy is a criminal, and vice versa. That's just not the case.
And how should we be thinking of psychopathy? Is it kind of a disease? Are there physiological changes? Is it something that can be cured? Is it something that's cured through like mental treatment, rehabilitation? Is it something that's could be cured potentially through chemical means? How should we be imagining it?
I think imagining it as a combination of personality traits makes most sense, which also suggests that it's pretty stable and not easily rectified, so to speak. And that seems to be what the numbers tell us as well. So people high in psychopathy have usually high rates of recidivism, I think, across criminal behaviors, which is, of course, what makes it complicated.
So kind of a grouping name for other terms, not like a binary kind of thing that you would maybe think of other types of disease. Either you kind of have it or you don't have it. This is more grouping of other ideas. And in that sense, if that's true, does that mean there's a continuum nature of psychopathy?
It's certainly a spectrum. You can be high or low in psychopathy, and at some point there would be a point where you would get the diagnosis of psychopathy.
Right. Okay. So let's go back to some of those three ideas that you were talking about, and also I know we're talking about some of your research with some of the brain scan ideas of how these things can be identified.
Yes, if you look at the terms, fearlessness, sounds like a good thing overall. It's basically a form of boldness, right? Impulsivity doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. So these are things that can be present and not not turn you towards a criminal career. And all of these things can be measured in different ways. So you can give people questionnaires asking about their behavior, and usually that will give you a good idea about how they range on these personality traits. You can do a clinical interview, so psychologists or psychiatrists will have certain structured interviews with questions that they ask you and kind of information that they want from you, which is also a good way to assess these things. But also could put people in the lab and do testing with them, and they will show different reactions based on where they are on these personality traits. So for example, somebody who's high on fearlessness, the fear center of their brain, or what's called the fear center of their brain, several areas of their brain processing this particular emotion, will respond differently. You could put people in an MRI scanner and could show them images of, for example, wild animals attacking, the camera. This will cause a fear reaction in everybody, but in people high on this fearless factor, their brain response will be muted. It will still be there, but it will be lower than that of other people. Likewise, with the impulsivity, you can give people a test where, for example, they have to push buttons all the time, except if like a red light appears, then they're supposed to just stop pushing any buttons. And so it's basically like playing whack-a-mole and suddenly being interrupted. And you can imagine how hard it is to kind of hold yourself back, right? You would still want to whack the next mole, basically. So people high in impulsivity will have a harder time inhibiting their own behavior. So that's another test you can do, and it's a behavioral test. So if you make more mistakes this way, this should correlate with higher levels of impulsivity as tested by a questionnaire or tested in an interview. So this is important to know. This means for all of these things, we have different levels of measurement and different ways of assessing them, which overall makes it a more reliable investigation. If you don't have to rely on self-report alone, or you don't have to rely on interview alone, but instead you can use a combination of these things.
Right. So looking at this example in Arkham, where there's been an uptick under investigation, the idea that the asylum had started processing some of these patients using fMRI, brain scans, and identifying more and more people as psychopaths. My first question for you is, in the criminal system and with the idea of some of these kind of rehabilitation ideas, why would you want to identify someone as a psychopath? What difference would that make to how you treated them as an individual, as a patient?
Yeah, it's definitely important to assess that. So let's say you have somebody who's coming into the legal system for violent acts that they have committed, or like aggressive behaviors. Even though different aggressive behaviors might be looking very similar, they might be caused by very different underlying factors. And again, you can measure that physiologically as well. So somebody who's aggressive, who sort of explodes with aggression in specific situations, that would be called reactive aggression. And that's, of course, is an issue, but it's also a different issue from psychopathy. Somebody who has this reactive kind of aggression, if you can measure them, you will find different physiological responses. And it seems to be more of a situation often of like not being able to handle your own emotions and not being able to handle your own physiological response. So you would find a bigger physiological response to stressors, for example, in these people. And this leads to a different way of treating it, right? So this leads to a way where you're going to try to get people to basically control themselves better, which doesn't seem to be the case that much for psychopathy. And this limits the possibilities to treat psychopathy as well, or to treat people high in psychopathy. And as I said, it seems to be high in recidivism. So it seems to be that even though some behaviors might look very similar on the surface, the chances to treat them might depend on underlying causes that are, for that reason, important to find out.
So if you look at the rogues gallery and take someone, for me, who would be, before this conversation, kind of an archetype of a psychopath like the Joker, is he a pretty good example of a psychopath? Would you say that?
He definitely checks some of the boxes, yes. I mean, he's definitely probably the highest in terms of callousness out of the Gotham rogues. You have, things like him not even looking at the people he's killing and things like that. So he seems to be very disconnected from any sort of emotional connection to other people. You also have that kind of boldness or fearlessness that enables him to, execute a very high-risk plan, for example, without regard for his own safety or the safety of others. I think he would check several of the important boxes there.
Great. And then by knowing this information, that these behaviors are driven by a place on the spectrum of psychopathy, that would change how you would approach a treatment plan. So going back to this uptick, as I say, upon looking on the data, this uptick occurred after the installation of some fMRI scanners at the asylum to look at, bring the technology up to date. And are we simply looking at better detection now, and better detection of saying, well, by looking at these changes in the brain, we can say it's definitely a psychopath, so throw them in the wing of last resort, and we're not going to try and really do any rehabilitation. They're beyond redemption in that sense. Is that what this brought to the asylum?
Yeah, it sounds like it. So it sounds like there's something fishy going on here. And now, as somebody who's doing brain research and fMRI research, you would probably think that I would rate that very highly in terms of diagnosing psychopathy. But in fact, if that's what's going on at the Arkham Asylum, if they have installed a new brain scanner system and suddenly they find a lot higher rates of psychopathy, they might be overinterpreting it. And it's kind of it's a way of what we call one risk is what we call reverse inference. And I'm going to try to explain what I mean by that. So let's imagine you're measuring the height of people all over the world, just how tall they are. And you find out very reliably that, across all different countries and cultures, on average, men are slightly taller than women, which I think is a true finding. So this is, of course, very interesting. It tells you, something about how bodies develop and so forth. And it's something that's worth, researching and publishing on. But then let's imagine that somebody asks you, here's this person. So I don't know if they're male or female, but their height is 5'6". Could you tell me if that's a man or a woman? Then you would say, well, not really. I mean, if somebody's extremely tall, probably the chance is higher that they're a man. But just kind of, in general, it's not possible to reliably tell you that, even though we know that men on average are slightly taller. That doesn't mean that everybody who's taller is a guy, right? It's kind of, it's not the same thing. That's what we mean by reverse inference. And there's a similar situation with brain scans and clinical diagnoses. So even if you find out that there's a certain area, a certain region in the brain that very reliably acts differently in people high in psychopathy, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can do the reverse action of looking at the brain and then diagnosing somebody. It can help. It can help make a diagnosis as sort of an assistive measure, as kind of a correlational statistical thing. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a whole range of different methods to diagnose people and to find out what's going on, and they have different degrees of reliability. And we should utilize all of those. So if somebody installs a new system, it just includes one more marker, and suddenly the number of diagnoses changes, then of course, that's always a good reason to kind of recheck your assumptions. One problematic thing that has been found out in recent years is that people on juries in the courtroom seem to overly rely on neuroscience evidence if they want to assess the risk that somebody would commit more crimes, or if they want to assess how guilty somebody is, how culpable somebody is, they seem to overly rely on brain images and brain scans because it always looks very scientific, it always looks very accurate, but that can be misleading. It can be something that's not a very reliable measure at all, but just that looks very data-driven. But in fact, the people's behavior in prison, for example, or whatever a psychiatrist says about them might actually be a more reliable marker.
Yeah, so in this instance, then, it could be that it's a case of taking the latest technology and believing that over more traditional markers. And thus also possibly creating a negative feedback loop with putting these individuals who may not be genuine psychopaths and may be available for rehabilitation in with people that could probably cause them to change their behavior or change some of their activities merely by association. Yeah, so I think a cursory warning to use all of the tools available from a diagnostic perspective and don't be swayed by the latest and brightest.
Yeah, as I like to say, fMRI, for example, so the functional magnetic resonance imaging, it's a great instrument for some things. It's a very useless instrument for other things. And you have to find out what it is that you want to know, and you have to find out how reliable your method is in this particular instance to see if it makes sense to use it. And if you would have a case of a personality trait or like a clinical diagnosis suddenly exploding in the population, that's always reason to take pause and to check if your assumptions are correct and your methods are correct. Because something like the rate of psychopathy shouldn't change very much over the course of time.
Just finally, looking out across the wider Batman world, if we take a more obscure villain like Amygdala, who is an individual who's had their amygdala removed, that's a physiological change in somebody's brain. They've actually had a piece of their brain removed, and in this particular individual caused some associative behavior. Would it be fair to look at that kind of thing as a reliable causation if that happened to any other individual as well? If I had my amygdala removed, would some of those behaviors occur without fail, or again, is it variable?
That's a very good point. So if there's something like that, so that the case of that Batman villain is extreme. So he's had his amygdala. So it's two areas of the brain. So you have one amygdala on each side, and both of them have been removed in this villain, and that is something that has happened to people in real life as well. So because of that, we know that parts of that character are accurate in that he cannot control his aggression very well, which seems to be something that happens in people in that case. But of course, it's also kind of exaggeration about it because usually people can control their behavior in some circumstances, but not in others. But talking about the wider question of how that would change the way we view changes in behavior, that's a solid question to ask. There's been cases of posthumous investigations into the brains of murderers or serial killers, where they found tumors or they found some sort of lesion that might have changed their behavior and their perception. And it's a very complicated ethical and legal question how you would rate that in a courtroom. You have cases where people feel like they're driven by voices in their head, they're driven by impulses that they cannot control, and they try to reach out for help. And later on, it turns out they actually had something in their brain that made them commit whatever crime they committed. And that seems to be a very clear-cut case of, something where the behavior seems to be driven by something where as you said, the same sort of disease or the same origin would cause similar behaviors in different people. And that should certainly be recognized at a legal level and ethical level. But there's also areas where we just don't know what's going on. If there's like something that causes pressure to certain parts of the brain, or something about some brain areas morphology, and we don't really know what it means, that might change behavior or it might not. And that's a case where it's very critical to put more research into how the brain works, so that afterwards, if we do have a brain scan and we do have a crime that has been committed, that we can accurately judge what's been going on without much guesswork around it.
That's all for now. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Jens for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It was fun.
You can follow Jens on Twitter at fmri_guy. If you'd like to discuss your research on a future episode, email us at info@figshare.com.